Weighing their options, the countries involved in the fight against ISIL debate new strategies as the radical group makes significant gains. Is a new approach on the way? Would it work? And what went wrong with the old one? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle, Carey. When U.S. President Barack Obama first assembled a coalition of nations to combat ISIL, he warned, in his words, it would be a long-term project. 9 months later, critics say the coalition's strategy is in tatters. U.S.-led airstrikes have failed to push back ISIL. Instead, the group has expanded its reach across Syria and Iraq. Now ministers from more than 20 countries have met in Paris to figure out what went wrong and how to fix it. The meeting follows what's seen as the coalition's biggest defeat in a year, the fall of the Iraqi city of Ramadi to ISIL last month. Now, that defeat has, of course, framed the debate, with officials insisting they have a plan, but that it'll take time. Well, let's take a listen first to Iraq's prime minister, who earlier had blamed the international community for not doing enough to fight ISIL.
Today, ISIL is a threat not just to Iraq, but to the whole world. We cannot fight ISIL in just Iraq, but in all areas of the world. We've been invited here to Paris by Foreign Minister Fabius and will meet with Prime Minister Hollande to strengthen the relations between Iraq and the anti-ISIL coalition. But we need more support for Iraqi forces fighting on the ground.
A big criticism of the Iraqi government has been its failure to reconcile sectarian differences in the country. France's foreign minister says Haider al-Abadi is committed to making that happen.
The military strategy cannot be taken without the reconciliation policy plan in Iraq. Everything is related, and this morning we were able to reconfirm the necessary commitment on the part of the Iraqi government in order to implement the reform plan and meet the expectations of all Iraqis so that they join in the fight against ISIL.
For more on this, I'm joined by our guests now. From Cambridge, Mansour, scholar at Carnegie Middle East Center and a fellow at the Iraq Institute for Strategic Studies in Beirut. From Washington, D.C., David Mack, former U.S. ambassador and a Middle East Institute scholar. And joining me here in Doha, Jean-Marc Rickli, assistant professor at the Department of Defense Studies at King's College. He is a military strategy specialist and focuses on Gulf and European security issues. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen, very much. Jean-Marc, I'm going to start with you. How would you characterize the efforts by the international community to defeat ISIL so far?
Right. There's been a mix of different strategies that have been applied. Obviously, the West and Western countries, for different reasons, don't want to put boots on the ground, and therefore rely heavily on air power and on forces on the ground. And the forces on the ground basically are provided by the Iraqi armed forces, supported by militias. The problem with that strategy is a problem of coordination. It's a problem related to make sure that you have a common objective. And so far, we are witnessing some strong tension between the different members of the coalitions, and therefore various levels of commitments.
Why 9 months in is everyone still not on the same page?
Right, because I think that the geopolitics has to be taken into account. They face a common enemy, Daesh, but in terms of the other problems surrounding the region, proxies that you're using in Iraq, the Shia militia, might be or are a threat when it comes to Yemen. So you have different states with different agendas. These agendas and these different interests meet in Iraq, but for most of the parts in the region, they're conflicting. So it's difficult to have a true coalition, which you don't have on the ground.
Mr. Mansour, do you agree with that part of the problem are conflicting interests and everyone not being on the same page as far as what strategy should be?
Yes, I would agree with that, and I would further that point by saying clearly there's been a complete misunderstanding of the political dynamics in Iraq and Syria. And a lot of the problems that we're seeing right now with the lack of military successes, or as successful as one would want the military to be, is because these underlying political problems, internal problems within the Shia camps, for example, Haider Abadi's contestations with his own leader of his own party, or former Prime Minister Maliki and others, as well as internal Sunni problems in Iraq, are completely being ignored. And these fissures will continue to plague and hamper any sort of military success in the region. And let's not forget, people talk about, and Abadi is asking for more help, more ground troops to come into Iraq, and they look at the surge as perhaps a successful model of ridding Iraq from al-Qaeda. However, one of the most important policies that Petraeus implemented was not just the military, but the political, in desectarianizing the military effort, in combating not just Sunni forces, but also Shia forces. Haider Abadi today is unable to really command that power and to desectarianize the emergence of Shia militias and leaders that are more powerful than him in the country.
Why is he unable? Is it because he is not the right person, or because you feel he doesn't grasp the issue?
Well, I think he feels a bit on his own. There are very powerful segments in Iraqi's political scene backed by Iran. I'm talking about people like former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, as well as the leader of the Badr Corps, Hadi al-Amiri, who are working against working against Abadi and looking to find mistakes in Abadi for them to come to prominence. And that's why Abadi is focused on, he went to Russia last month, he went to America, he's trying to get the international community involved because he's trying to find power in another way. The reality in Iraq today is that the strongest power by far is Iran, and Iran is really in charge of the political and security situation.
Okay, we're going to talk more about what other countries in the region need to do in just a moment. That's a very important point. But Mr. Mack, earlier today at the press conference after the meeting in Paris, Haider al-Abadi rejected the notion that that ISIL was actually formed in Iraq. He said that it was a serious problem that had spread to them. What do you say to that?
Well, this so-called Islamic State, Daesh, to use the Arabic acronym, really results from the failures of two Arab governments, the government in Syria and the government in Iraq. Both the Baghdad regime under former Prime Minister Maliki and the Syrian regime under Bashar al-Assad failed to unify their entire country, and basically discriminated in a whole range of ways against people that didn't share their sectarian approach to politics. Moreover, they often misplayed their hands in dealing with outside governments, whether it was Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, or the U.S. and the European countries. So I think one can say that this so-called Islamic State is not some gigantic force that is pushing everything aside. It's basically succeeded to the extent it has because of the failure of two Arab governments and a number of smaller players within the body politic of both Syria and Iraq. It's going to be hard to put this back together. There are very diverse interests of the external powers as well as the ones on the ground. But I think we're beginning to see the emergence of a successful international approach to this, in which we will simply concede that we don't all have the same agreements, and we'll try to find those overlapping areas where we can agree.
Jean-Marc, let me ask you this. This goes to a point that Mr. Mack just made. The French foreign minister, in fact, today said in Paris that Iraq cannot be stabilized without stabilizing Syria. And of course, Mr. Mack is saying that the situations are connected. But is the solution the same in both places?
Well, I think the statement from Mr. Fabius is quite is quite right. Obviously, Daesh control territories both Iraq and Syria. The specificities of the two countries are nonetheless different. In Iraq, you face a country where there has been a massive effort at de-Baathification and sidelining the Sunni majority, whereas the Sunni minority. Whereas in Syria, it's a current government that has applied different strategy against its own people. So the dynamics are different. What I would like to underline is that the problem in Syria and Iraq probably goes now beyond just these two states, as we have seen that Daesh is actually expanding to different countries. Lately it is Libya, and for a European standpoint, it would be interesting to see the reaction, because now Syria is not at the top of the list on the agenda. Libya has become the most acute problem in terms of European security due to the migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea and trying to join Europe through Italy and Malta. And therefore, the European commitment towards operation in Iraq and Syria might actually be less than what people in the region would expect, because the problems have shifted from a European perspective.
Let's talk about Ramadi for a moment, because that really seemed to be the turning point in the last few weeks, when so many people seem to realize how poorly things seem to be going in Iraq. Mr. Mansour, let me ask you about that. How in the world did Ramadi fall?
Well, I think Ramadi was a consequence of trying to play this narrative game and this propaganda game that we have going on both sides to embellish victories. For a long time, you know, what you were hearing from Western sources was the Islamic State is on the decline, you know, they couldn't take over Kobani, they're having issues, they've lost Tikrit, whereas the realities on the ground were not that easy. It's not that plain and simple. What we have today is a protracted conflict. And, I mean, in Ramadi specifically, because you asked, the forces there were fighting against, you know, the so-called Islamic State for a year and a half, and they just couldn't bear it anymore. And once they saw one of the factions retreat, they began to retreat, and the city was taken over. Now, that's not to say that Ramadi will remain under, you know, the so-called Islamic State for a long period of time. But what we have today is a battle that, you know, they're right to say it will take a while, and you're going to have defeats and victories in this battle, and it shouldn't come as a surprise when you do have a loss here or there.
In fact, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry wasn't physically at this meeting today. As most of us know, he's in the hospital because of a biking accident. But the State Department did release some of his comments about this. And one thing he said in particular, he said, what happened in Ramadi was a setback, but it is one that we can help the Iraqis overcome. One immediate step we are taking is to ship anti-tank rockets for use against the kind of suicide vehicles deployed in Ramadi. Mr. Mack, are steps like that going to make a difference?
If the Iraqi forces using those anti-tank missiles are properly trained, and that includes Kurdish Peshmerga forces, it includes the Iraqi security forces, and hopefully it will also include some of those roughly 4,000 Sunni Arab tribesmen that the United States has been working with. Those are very, very serious weapons against a truck bomb, for example. They can demolish it from a long distance. If you have proper intelligence coordination as to where that target is, and if the people using the weapons are properly trained. That's been the problem all along. We have to have boots on the ground that will force the adversary to concentrate, just in the way that the Kurdish forces at Kobani forced Daesh to concentrate, and then air power can be effective. Air power is not effective if you have people scattered, and particularly if they're scattered among civilian populations that you don't want to bomb into and cause all kinds of collateral damage. So there has to be a lot of coordination. And even though it is very imperfect, the Haider al-Abadi government in Baghdad has got to be a key ally for outside groups, the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and there is also going to be, I believe, eventually direct deliveries of equipment to the Kurdish Peshmerga and to the Sunni Arab tribal militias that are being stood up in Anbar province and eventually, I hope, in Mosul. But that's going to have to be done in coordination with the government in Baghdad.
Let's talk more about what you said, because you said quite a bit there, Mr. Mack. So, Jean-Marc, let's try to dig into what he said. He mentioned boots on the ground, which we hear often, the lack of intelligence, the lack of coordination. First of all, let's start with boots on the ground. Whose boots on the ground?
Right. For obvious reason, the boots on the ground won't come from the Western countries. So they have to come from Arab states and from...
Are you speaking of regional leadership stepping up?
Basically, what we're facing here is an operation where it's pitting one type of Islam, Sunni versus Shia. So you cannot retake this territory, which is majority Sunni, with Shia forces. So there is a problem of legitimacy, and you will just steer sectarianism. So you have, if you want to put boot on the ground, you have to put soldiers who are considered as being friendly to the people on the ground. So it has to be Iraqis with contribution from Arab countries in the region, but you have to bear in mind that there are other conflicts in the region, in Yemen, in Libya, and therefore capabilities are limited.
Mr. Mansour, let's pick up on a point that Mr. Rickli just said, that part of the troops on the ground should be troops from the area, and in particular, he's saying Iraqi forces who clearly outnumber the ISIL fighters, but still have not been able to truly defeat them. What do you make of Defense Secretary Ash Carter's comments that the Iraqi army doesn't have the will to win this fight?
Well, I mean, we've been commenting on what he said all week, or in the last 2 weeks. It was a bit of a setback. A lot of Iraqis weren't happy, and we viewed it, and a lot viewed it as being politically irresponsible from someone at that level to say. But there was some truth in what his comments. There is a lack of will to fight. However, that lack of will isn't a lack of military will. It's again, as I continue to stress today, it's a political problem. What you have in Iraq at the moment is a crisis of trust. The Sunni communities don't trust that if they do engage and if they do fight off Daesh, which most of them actually are against, let's be fair, they don't know what comes next. They don't want to just fight off Daesh for these militias, the Shia militias that they're afraid of, to come and take over, or in some areas the Kurdish Peshmerga to come and take over. So it's really that crisis of trust that's impeding what would be a vast number of local fighters to fight off the Islamic State. And therefore, as I say, the solution really needs to have political elements to it. They can fight, but what you need to do is show them compromises and show them incentivize them to fight. And so to that end, there is at the moment a lack of will to fight, because they don't view fighting a successful fight at the moment as being advantageous to their future.
Mr. Mack, I see you nodding as Mr. Mansour is talking. So who is in the position to step up and be trusted and lead?
Well, both Renad and Jean-Marc have made the very, very solid points that you have to have trusted people who move in and reclaim areas once there is some kind of military defeat of the Islamic State forces. And the lack of trust that both Sunni Arabs and Kurds also, I've just talked to some people from the Kurdistan regional government recently who were in Washington. Their lack of trust of the Abadi government is very great. And similarly, none of the rebels fighting Daesh in Syria want to see the Syrian government come in and take over territories if Daesh is defeated. So there is this problem. But I should also emphasize that with proper coordination among some of the outside powers, we can, first of all, put a little more pressure and as well as encouragement from the Arab governments toward Prime Minister al-Abadi to do the right things vis-a-vis his own population. And in the northern part, and this is a very vulnerable situation for Turkey. It has long borders with both Iraq and Syria. The areas around those borders are heavily occupied at the present time by the forces of this Daesh, this Islamic State. There is very intensive coordination going on now between the United States and Turkey to come up with some kind of plan and put some real U.S. Resources and some real Turkish resources into some kind of plan to stabilize some of the areas along the Turkish border on the Syrian and Iraqi sides, pushing Daesh away from the border. I think that this would enable both friendly Iraqi elements and friendly Syrian elements to occupy those areas, stabilize those areas, and that could be a major contribution.
Jean-Marc, let me ask you this. You have all talked about other countries in the region needing to step up. You've talked about Iraq needing to step up. Does the U.S. need to do more?
Well, the question is the U.S. willing to do more, I think. And at least the perception from the Arab countries in the region is that one of disengagement. And therefore, if you look in real terms, the U.S. has even increased its efforts in the region, but there is a matter of perception. And so in that kind of conflict, when you fight in a coalition, you have what is more important is not just doing more, is better coordination. Mm-hmm. And so far, there is a problem with coordination because if you think for operations, for instance, in Europe with NATO, you had a military alliance and you had states coordinating training for that. Here, you assemble a group of very diverse states and non-state actors, and you try to launch a very important military operation. So, doing more, yes, but technology will not solve the problem. I think I concur with Mansour by stating that the problem is primarily political. And obviously you need military force to stop the momentum of ISIS, but
what next?
And what next? And you need to solve the problem of sectarianism rising in that part of the world. And no weapon will actually be able to fix that problem.
Okay. Mr. Mansour, let me ask you the final question here. Will we be having this discussion a year from now?
It is likely. We might be talking about another region, perhaps an upcoming battle to move other parts of Anbar. But this will be a protracted, as I mentioned, conflict. There's no reason to assume that in a year's time we'll have gotten rid of the Islamic State in Iraq, at least. And part of the reason for that is because we still haven't really understood the problem. If we're still talking about sending forces and if we're still talking within military terms, we really haven't understood the underlying problems that are erupting, and that will erupt every now and then. And so, as grim as this sounds, and as pessimistic as this conclusion may lead one towards, it's very likely that we will have successes in the next year, okay, but the entire solution would not have been solved.
All right, thank you to all of my guests, Renad Mansour, David Mack, and Jean-Marc Rickli. And thank you for watching. As always, we like to hear your thoughts. So you can contact us on our program page at aljazeera.com. You can also post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Richelle, Carey, and the entire team here, goodbye for now.